Well, I haven't traveled abroad as much as I would like. I've mostly visited Western and Southern Europe and then the Middle East. And here in the United States, I've been fortunate enough to visit almost every state in the Union. But out of all those places I've been, would you like to guess where I've found the local people to be the most friendly, welcoming, and hospitable? You give up? Hands down, it's the Middle East. I think Americans have kind of a skewed understanding of that region because a lot of what we hear about it has to do with conflict going on there. But when you get down to how the average person on the street behaves towards strangers, I've honestly never met any friendlier folks in the whole world. On one trip to Egypt, I decided to just wander around the city of Cairo by myself for a while. In the old part of the city, the streets can get really narrow and winding. And even though I had a map with me, I got completely lost. And so there I was, standing in this very narrow residential street. It was really more like an alley. And the buildings had to be several hundred years old, if not a lot older. And I did not know which way was north or south or anything. This was long before you could locate yourself on a mobile phone app. And I just had no phone anyway. So I knocked on a random door. And the man who appeared looked me over. And he spoke some English, and I explained that I was lost and I needed to get back to this museum where the other people in my group were probably wondering where in the heck I had disappeared to. And this man insisted that I come into his home and he would show me on my map where I needed to go to find the museum again. But first, I needed to have a cup of tea with him. So I went into a small apartment, total strangers to each other, and we sat down and he made some tea. He then asked me about myself. He showed me photos of his family. He asked if I was a football fan, and of course by that he meant what Americans call soccer. And he told me he loved Elvis Presley and showed me his very impressive collection of Elvis records and wanted to know if I loved Elvis too. And when I told him I had been to Graceland in Memphis, well, then that conversation took up the next 30 minutes at least. I really don't even know how long I was there. I lost track of time. But then his son, who was about 8 years old, came home from school, and they spoke in Arabic. And then he told me that his son would take me back to the museum. I started to protest. That wasn't necessary, but he insisted, and he apologized for not taking me back himself, but he needed to get back to sleep. He said he worked nights and he slept all during the day. Now, when I left, he took my hand in both of his and he looked me in the eye for a long time with this very meaningful look, and he said to me, "Elvis, thank you for stopping by." And then his son led me by the hand, and he wouldn't let go of my hand, all through these narrow winding streets, all the way back to the museum. Never would have gotten there without his help. It was really astounding. I had woken this man up. I was a complete stranger, a foreigner. We only barely spoke the same language, and he asked me in for tea. We talked about sports, and we shared a mutual admiration for Elvis. And he made sure, by sending his little son to lead me, that I would make my way back safe and sound where I needed to be. So later on, I told one of my Egyptian guides about this and how lucky I was just to have happened to knock on that very nice man's door. And the guide smiled and he shook his head and he said, if you had knocked on any door on that street, the exact same thing would have happened. Hospitality is who we are in Egypt. I often think about that afternoon, all these years ago, when I'm walking down a path, figuratively speaking, and there is a fork in the road, and standing at that place, at that fork, is a stranger. To choose one way is to engage with that person, to look them in the eye, maybe even to get to know them a little bit. If I choose to walk down the other way, that's to more or less ignore that person, to not see them really, to avert my eyes, to mind my own business, and to just keep on going. All of us face that choice many times every day. And there are always extenuating circumstances. We're busy, or we're not rushed at all. We simply don't feel like engaging, or maybe we do. Or maybe there's something about that person that in just an instant we judge that they are worthy of our time and attention, or if there's someone we might be better off avoiding. So we behave as if we know who a stranger is, their character, their social status, their attitudes, their beliefs, what matters to them and what does not, all in an instant, and without ever really knowing anything about them. These days, we might not have as many in-person encounters due to all this social distancing and maybe not going out as much. But we still have encounters and we still make choices. What we choose to watch on TV, what we click online, and what we don't. The news stories we read, or the ones that we avoid reading because they don't maybe go with what we already think. Today, I think we're increasingly aware that many of us have been practicing a certain kind of not talking to strangers, and it's based on the color of their skin. Most of us, I think it's safe to say, as many black friends and acquaintances as we might have, we have no earthly idea what being a black person in 21st century America is like. I know how true that is for me. I've long fashioned myself as one of the enlightened people who never makes assumptions about anyone based on their race. Because after all, I've read lots of books about the long and ugly history of racism, about how our economic system, in large part, was built on the basis of white people profiting and having the ability to realize their hopes and dreams at the expense of enslaved and subjugated black people. I've read W.E.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. I was thrilled at the very idea that a black man could even be elected president in America. But the sad truth is, too many times when I came to a fork in the road where a black person stood, I did not stop or engage or look them in the eye or listen to their story. I took the other path. Maybe I justified my choice by telling myself we would not have enough in common. Maybe I was too busy. Maybe I felt I already knew enough about them. Maybe I believed that if I needed to learn from that stranger, then it was their job to explain things to me. Maybe, because I was operating under a different set of life experiences, I was simply blind to many things. Maybe I pretended to believe that my whiteness really didn't give me any inherent advantages, that I'd worked hard to earn what I have and no one gave me any breaks. Maybe I told myself that lie enough times that I actually believed it. And maybe I felt it wouldn't really matter for me to pause long enough to be welcoming to that stranger at the fork in the road. I hope and pray that I know better now what hospitality really means. If the Bible has one consistent theme in practically every one of its 66 books, it's hospitality. It always comes into play. It's always somewhere in the story or in the words spoken, no matter really what page you land on. It practically slaps us in the face in a place where Jesus tells his disciples in no uncertain terms that welcoming the stranger is the same thing as welcoming him. That's clear enough. What else can we say about that teaching other than how much we routinely seem to ignore it? Social scientists have played tricks on people to study how and why they show hospitality and welcoming to some people and not to others. You probably heard the story about the church where a disheveled homeless man wandered into the service when the pastor was on vacation, and this homeless man sat on the front pew. After a while, an elder of the church, who was very uncomfortable with the presence of this homeless man, and at the urging of some other members, went over and asked him to leave. Turns out the homeless man was the pastor in disguise. He wanted to see how his congregation would treat a stranger in their midst. I think the pastor might have gotten fired for that prank. What that old story points out is that we often have biases we don't even realize. Did the elder think of himself as a bad guy? Not at all. He had nothing against homeless people, per se. He was just doing what he thought was appropriate under the circumstances. The homeless man simply did not belong. He wasn't dressed appropriately. He was being a distraction. He did not fit in. He made people feel uncomfortable. He was different. And chances are he probably would have asked people for a handout after the service. The elder and the other members believed they already knew who the homeless person was. If they had met him at a fork in the road, they would have ignored him and avoided him. But he clearly wasn't one of them, and he had invaded their space uninvited. So something had to be done. The reason hospitality is practically on every page of the Bible is because God and the people who told stories that became the words in the Bible, stories and words spanning different times and places, they knew that the common denominator in telling the story of God's relationship with humanity was that you really don't have humanity, at least in the way it's meant to be, without hospitality. You don't have understanding of each other without hospitality. You don't have peace without it. You don't have hope without it. You don't live in a world where people are regarded as worthy and valuable in their own right without it. You don't have justice without it. And the overarching story of God's spirit of loving kindness living through you and me, that stops cold without hospitality. Passing by the stranger, ignoring them, avoiding them, omitting them from our consideration, not stopping long enough to listen and to understand and to be a friend is the same thing. It's the exact same thing as closing the door in the face of God, according to Jesus. But hospitality in our hearts and in our voices and in our hands and feet, that's where love happens. It's where peace, hope, joy, and justice happens. And it happens in recognizing the biases and the privileges we didn't even realize that we had, and acknowledging when and where we've ignored it or thought it didn't really matter, and then doing whatever it takes to make hospitality real. It happens when we read and listen and donate and vote and organize and march and invest. It's not enough to believe I'm hospitable by saying I'm not a racist. I must be an anti-racist. So I hope and pray I understand that what I think I know now about hospitality and about what it means to be that person at the fork in the road still amounts to not nearly enough. And that the rest of my life will be about learning and understanding so that I can be more like that man whose door I happened to knock on one day when I was so very lost. The man, that person who opened it and who invited me in so that I was welcomed and lost no more.